by John. As I mentioned, Status and Money, How to Incentivize Work in a Meritocracy.
Okay, thank you, Naveen, and thank you, Marina, for inviting us to speak. This is a paper, as you can see, with Pradeep Dubey, who's on screen. And we've been at it for quite a few years. Hopefully we have our story straight by now. So the literature on status is very old. It really began with Veblen, who talked, I'm sure you've heard, of conspicuous consumption. And that was an effort to show that you had consumed more than your neighbors, keeping up with the Joneses. Easterlin had another famous paper in 1974. Then there were a series of papers arguing whether it should be cardinal utility, how much your consumption exceeded someone else's, or just whether it was above somebody else's. And a more modern literature was started by Cole, Maleth, and Postaway about status as a signal, so instrumental. So what we're going to do is try to argue that status may be instrumental, but it's also important for its own sake, and we're going to concentrate on the connection between status and performance rather than consumption. And we're going to say it's not just performance and the ranking of performance, but categorizing performance. And these categorizations should be meritocratic. Better performance should get more status. But once we realize there's some freedom to categorize the performances into different categories, then we can think of a designer who's going to design the categories. And so we're going to imagine a designer who's an employer, could be the ruler of a country, but for concreteness, an employer. And since status provides utility and incentives to get into a higher category, the employer can use status, not just money, to induce his workers, her workers, to work more. And she wants to do that in the least possible way. So how to combine status and money to get people to work in the least possible way. And we're going to solve, at least in two special cases, the homogeneously skilled employees and the disparately skilled employees. We're going to solve for the optimal status categories, when status is alone, for the optimal wages, when wages function without status, and look at how they should be combined. And the three themes that are going to emerge are that masking is very important. You don't want to, every little increase in performance should not give you the right to be in a different category. There should be broad categories. Secondly, shame is more important than honor. If you want to incentivize people with status, you should concentrate on the people at the bottom, the least able people, and their status really is avoidance of shame. So that's more important than the giving of honors to the people at the very top. And finally, the result of all this combination of status and wages is that the people at the top who haven't been incentivized by much status are going to get huge wages. So why do we think status is important and connected to performance? Well, just think of the words. Kings wage war for glory. Soldiers give their lives for honor. Military officers compete for rank. Gangsters take lives for respect. Professors publish for prestige. Students compete for grades. Children obey for praise. Athletes compete for medals or Olympic gold. The Greeks competed for honorific prizes. The best playwright, the best painter, the best of the Achaeans. Indian analogs too, I'll leave that to Pradeep in the question period. The French wanted to be buried in the Pantheon, they still do. My wife's grandfather is. The corporate officers compete for promotions and titles. The students protest, demanding dignity. Donors compete for admiration. Everybody wants publicity. Ordinary people strive for recognition. In Marlon Brando on the waterfront said the famous words, "I could have been a contender, I could have been somebody." Ordinary people strive for reputations. I did my duty. I lived an honest life. I was faithful. Admiral Nelson said, England expects every man to do his duty. Shame comes to those who don't. So status is instrumental. Maybe it helps you get married, it helps you get more money, it helps you get a better business partner, but people still care about status even when they're past the time of getting money or marrying or getting business partners. Status is valued for its own sake. There are so many words it must be. So Marlon Brando, in fact, says not only that, status is at least as important as money. He could have taken the money. He took a dive in a boxing match. That's why he lost. He took money instead of trying to win. That's when he says, I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody. He valued status in retrospect more than money. J.P. Morgan put it more concretely. Money is just a way of keeping score. Oh, most of economics concentrates on consumption. There are too many names. It's too powerful a motivator to ignore. And so that's what we want to talk about. So if you think about all these categories and where the words are applied, they all have to do with performance, publishing, winning battles, getting medals. It's all for performance. Well, the status comes from rank, how well you perform, but it's not exactly how you perform. It's how you're categorized as performing. And these categories we call titles. So like general or the colonel, those are titles. So the generals have done better than the colonels, but we don't necessarily distinguish between all generals. They have the same title. So the way we are going to assign status utility, which we've done before, is to look at every one of the agents' titles, T1 through Tn, and give status to a player N, an agent N, his status. The designer is going to be she, and the players are going to be he. His status comes from how many players he outranks minus how many players outrank him. So we introduced this, it's a fairly obvious definition, it's probably been used before, but anyway, we did it in 2006, and Moldavana, Sela, and she used this, our thing, to analyze a similar problem in a different setting in 2007. So you notice that here status is linear in the number of agents. You could have imagined, an extra status boost for being the top agent. Here, being top as opposed to second top just gives you one extra person to count below you. So it's linear in the number of agents. You get the same status for being above as you lose for being behind. Everybody attaches the same status utility as everybody else. This is the simplest case to analyze. It also means the sum of status is 0. So status is a complete rat race.
John, just a clarification. Are you
Sure.
assuming that sigma function is monotonic?
Sigma is a constant.
Oh, it's a
It's
constant.
just a constant multiplying the number of people below you minus the number of people above you. So it's just a constant, and it's the same constant to everybody. As I said, it could have been a function, as you say, a nonlinear function, and a convex function attaching a lot more status to being at the very top. But we've taken it linear here. So sigma just multiplies the people below you and above you. Thank you for the question. So now, as I said, we're going to focus on the owner, the leader, she's going to set a schedule. So what does she do? She looks at all the performances of all the N agents, assigns titles to them, and gives them all wages. And she has to do this, though, in a non-discriminatory way. So you have to treat people the same. You can't specially privilege one class of people over another. So we regard this as commonsensical. It's tied up with merit. It's hard to avoid this if you're talking about merit. The feminist platform, the early days of feminism, one of the leading causes was equal pay for equal work. It just seems it's a reasonable thing to do if you're talking about a meritocracy. And furthermore, greater performance must lead to higher pay and a higher title. So to show you how ingrained this is in the public mind, Babe Ruth, this is a famous story, the Yankee home run king, was asked in 1939 whether he's embarrassed to be getting a higher salary than the President of the United States. And he said, no, I'm not embarrassed. I had a better year than he did. Performance is what gives you the right to a higher payoffs. So performance depends on effort, on skill, and chance. So how should a leader, how should the designer award meritocratic titles and performance-based money in order to elicit the most effort at the least money cost? The ruler or the owner can't change abilities. She's not interested in rewarding people for higher ability. She wants to get them to work. She wants to design the scheme to get them to work as hard as possible. So to be very concrete, we specialize this even more, although I think it applies, to rulers of countries, not just to employers. But to be very concrete, imagine the owner with N employees. They can only do two things, shirk or work, and they lose utility for working. So there are N of them. They each have to choose their effort levels, E1 through En. That produces their outputs. The performance is just individual outputs, which for simplicity depends on their own effort. But of course, it could depend in different ways, depending on the skills of the players. And then there's luck involved too. So the XI is going to depend on EI plus the skill of I plus the luck I had. We just assume that higher effort, other things equal, means higher expected output. So the owner can only see the outputs, can't see the skill or the luck. So given the outputs at X1 through Xn, she assigns the titles and the wages, and these functions, these are schedules, the titles and the wage schedules have to be anonymous. Permuting outputs among players permutes the wages and titles accordingly, and monotonic Xn going up means the wage relative to everyone else has to go up or stay the same. So the payoffs, as we said, when everyone gives effort E1 through En, they produce outputs X1 through Xn. On that basis, they're assigned, agent N is assigned a wage, Wn, and everyone's assigned a title, and so there's status utility to agent N, and if agent N chose to work, he loses utility for having worked. So we assume that UN is concave, and if you look at this, you'll see that it's a game. Given the effort levels, the payoffs ensue, expected payoffs ensue, and people are going to be playing, the agents, the workers are going to be playing a Nash equilibrium. So the goal of the owner is to choose these schedules. It's a principal agent problem, so that given the schedules, all the workers play the game, not the workers, the employees play the game, deciding to work or to shirk, and the owner has to choose the schedules to induce all work as a Nash equilibrium, and she's interested in choosing the schedules that will get all work at the minimum total wage bill. So it doesn't look that hard a problem to solve, but we couldn't even solve that, so we've specialized it even more. So we're going to consider, first of all, absolute schedules and relative schedules. So an absolute schedule is, you look at all the scores can all be ordered, and so a priori you set different absolute thresholds for the titles A, B, and C, and then wherever your score falls, that's the title that you get. Or you could set relative rankings, so you take the number of people, there are 10 people, the number of people you intend to give each of the 4 titles to. When you see the scores, you assign the titles accordingly. So one other thing to keep in mind is whether the wages are public or private. If the wages, see these are the titles, the different categories for titles. If the wages are private, they have to be a step function because they're monotonic. So they're going to be a step function, and the partition generated by the wage step functions doesn't have anything to do with the titles if no one can see the wages. But if they're public, then a wage is a signal. It's like giving another title. Did you get below or above a certain wage? And so it's going to refine the title step function. So obviously public wages ties the hands of the owner because it forces her to add more titles, which she might not want to do that. So we focus on 2 polar extremes, the homogeneous case and the disparate skilled case. The homogeneous case, everyone's got the same skill, and the disparate case is the alphas are so much better than the betas, they always score above the betas. So we're going to solve for the optimal schedules, if you can only do titles, if you can do only wages, if you can do them both, and we'll see therefore how status affects wages.
John, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yes. So
Abraham, yes.
Yes, you're looking for optimizing such a scheme, and you give a freedom to select the titles. But
yes.
But you assume that the individuals have a preference over the titles. But is it not the case that the utility over the title depends also how you construct the titles?
Well, we've assumed, you might think that, but we've assumed that all people intrinsically care about is how many people they're ranked above or below. So if the ruler changes the ranking partition, so makes a lot of people tie, that will change the number of people below you in the lower titles or above you titles, because everyone in your title will be equal to you, so not affecting your status utility. So we think of the ranking above or below as the intrinsic utility, and therefore it shouldn't change if you change the categories. It just changes how many people you're able to count below and above you, because it's not just how you think you're ranked. You care about how other people think you're ranked, and they don't maybe see your score. They can just see your title. So it's your title which is going to give you your public ranking, and your utility fundamentally is about how many people you're ranked above or below, not the name of the title.
Okay, so this is a basic assumption that this doesn't change with you deciding on compensation as functions of title, even if they are secret.
Yeah, the compensation, the wage, if it's secret, yeah, then you can give a wage and nobody knows it, so it doesn't affect your title. But if the wage is public, everybody knows your wage is higher than me, so it's like you have a higher title. The ruler can't hide from me that you've got a higher, you're somehow in a different category from me.
But sometimes the wage will be very steep in your ranking, and sometimes it will be very moderate. And the question is, would it not impact the action of individuals where you are in the rank, and what is the benefit from a slightly higher rank? Or
well, you care about the wage in a cardinal way. You care about utility of wage. So how much money is important to you, but just because you got a lot more money, we're assuming, as you say, we're assuming that it just means you're ranked higher than me. It doesn't matter how much higher your wage is than me, you're still ranked above me, plus you do a lot more consumption than me. Yes, that's an assumption. Okay, thank you. So now the first theme is that we're going to have very few of these titles. You could have a title, you could have one title just for the best, or you could have a title, every different performance could be revealed. You could just simply tell everybody the performance, and that could be public, like at Oxford and Cambridge, where they rank every one of the students. Or you could put them into a few grades like ABC. Well, that's what's going to be efficient. And similarly, wages will turn out to be just a few wages will be the optimal thing to do, even though there are many different possible performances, many different skill levels. And the biggest jump in wages is going to come at the top. Okay, and finally, to repeat, we're going to concentrate the incentive at the bottom. That's where it's more important. It's going to arise from a very meritocracy. So at the bottom, you concentrate the status incentive. At the top, you concentrate the wages, which is why they're gigantic wages at the top, and status very important at the bottom. So what is the basic reason for masking? Well, there are two reasons that are going to emerge. Number one, the wage, the first reason is, of course, it's more expensive if that's the reason why you have only a few titles and a few wage categories, because it's more expensive to have them monotonic. And why is that? Well, it could be for certain classes, and we'll give an example in a second, for certain areas of output, getting higher, conditional on that area of outputs, means you're more likely to be less, to have worked less hard rather than harder. And so you want to hide the fact, you don't want to reward somebody for working less hard. And secondly, clumping outputs together gives people near the bottom a chance to come equal with people who have much more ability. So if you have too fine a gradation, you'll never be able to compete. You'll never get an equal title to someone who's more able. But if you have very broad categories, a less able person can earn the same title as a more able person, and that gives him at the bottom incentive to compete. So why is status concentrated at the bottom and wages at the top? It's because of meritocracy. First of all, it sounds counterintuitive, but that's because we think of absolute honor. So the greatest honors go to the people at the top. In a meritocracy, they're going to get the best performers, are going to have the highest honors. But what I'm talking about, what Pradeep and I are talking about, are the marginal effect of extra status. And the marginal effect of extra status should be deployed at the bottom. Now, why is that? Because if you give a wage to someone who does better than poor, does middling, so a wage increase in the middle somewhere or towards the bottom, because it's a meritocracy, you have to raise everybody's wage above that. Whereas if you raise the wage for someone between excellent and outstanding, then you don't have to raise anybody's wage above that. So it's easier, it's cheaper to raise wages at the top than to do it at the middle. That's going to be a key idea in the analysis. So the employers, in fact, they do use lots of titles and status. You know, McDonald's and Walmart, they have Employee of the Month. They do these titles for people at the bottom. They don't do it just for the CEOs. There are very few titles, though, compared to the number of workers or potential performance level. There's often jumps in wages without so much obvious differences in skill. And of course, there's a huge jump for the CEO. So to the extent that our analysis makes sense, the advice we would give to governments is that they should pay attention to status, talking about the status categories of the people near the bottom, you know, faithfulness, doing your duty, honesty. Those are the things that the rulers should be concentrating on repeating and establishing. And they should be emphasizing those norms. And also, it's better if they can, well, all right, let's leave it at that. So now, misogynist.
John,
yes.
I have a question. So you said that the role of having these broad categories has to do with this idea of the low skill agents thinking that they will be able to catch up with the higher skill agents. Will you have a result about how broad the categories are depends on differences in skill across the agents?
Yeah, we're going to solve two simple cases completely. So we won't have the general result that you would like, but we'll solve exactly two special cases, which I'm about to describe. So the one is the ex-ante identically skilled agents. So if you work, you have distribution over output Fn. If you don't work, Gn, which has lower expected output. So the problem of the owner is to partition the output space Q into intervals of titles, and also have a step function, which is wages, which is monotonic. And if the wages are public, they have to be measurable with respect to the titles. So the expected, so she wants to minimize, F is the, when you work, F of X times W of X is the expected wage that she's paying the workers, such that the status incentive they have plus the wage incentive they have is enough to pass the threshold for working, so everybody's going to work. And the status incentive is you just look at how many people you come in front of or behind if you shirk while everyone else is working, as opposed to when you work while everyone else is working. And your wage incentive, of course, in the end amounts to, you know, what's your expected utility of wage if you work versus whether you shirk. And as I said, it has to be measurable if they're public. So to take an example, let's assume that there's an exam, there are two students, and a student who works studies, this is the end of the year exam, student who works studies the whole year, both semesters. So there are two questions on the exam, one for semester one, one for semester two. The worker has a 60% chance of getting each of them correct independently, so 36% chance of getting them both right, 40% squared, 16% chance of getting them both wrong, 48% chance of getting exactly one. A student who shirks only does one semester, and then he doesn't do anything for the other semester. It's easier to remember just one semester's work. He has an 80% chance instead of 60 of getting that right, but he can never get two questions right because he hasn't studied the second one. So if you have the fine partition, the obvious one, you just reveal the performances, then the probability that the worker comes ahead of the shirker minus the reverse is 32.8%. But if instead you had only two categories, an A for getting a perfect score and a B for anything else, you'd have a 36% chance of the worker coming ahead of the shirker. You can see here that that's a better incentive scheme than the other one. So that's the way to do status in this example. Grading on a curve, what would that mean? Well, grading on a curve, you can either give everyone the same grade, or you can say one's an A and one's a B, which means you're distinguishing who's ahead or behind. That's the same thing with only two people as the fully revealing thing. So that's going to provide status incentive of 32.8, which is less than the 36% chance you got by having the two grades on an absolute scale. So in fact, there's a theorem, no matter how many people, et cetera, it's always better to have absolute versus relative. You can lower the cost of, it's always better to, the status, you can get higher status incentive. You can raise the incentive, it's all symmetric here, everybody's identical. So whatever the titles partition is, it gives rise to an incentive I to work, and I is higher in the best absolute scale than in the best relative scale. That's a general theorem. So now to figure out what the solution to this problem is in the absolute scale, we need this definition of stochastic dominance. So two random variables on output space X and Y, X stochastically dominates Y on an interval AB. If wherever you cut the interval at theta, the probability that X, conditional on them both being in the interval, the probability is higher that X is in the upper half. X uniformly dominates Y if on AB, if no matter what subinterval CD you look at and cut the subinterval, X is more likely to be on the high end than the low end. So uniformly just means applies to every interval. Stochastic dominance applies to the interval of the whole. So our theorem is now we can solve this problem. The optimal status, which is, remember, whatever status incentive, whatever partition you give gives rise to an incentive to work. To make that incentive be maximal, you have to satisfy the inside-outside theorem. It's necessary and sufficient. The partition has to satisfy the property that inside each cell of the partition, conditional on being on that interval, the shirker stochastically dominates the worker, but outside, across partition cells, the worker uniformly dominates the shirker. So that gives two corollaries, that if you have uniform domination to begin with, then you should have the full, the perfectly fine partition is the best thing to do. It also gives the corollary that if in some interval the shirker uniformly dominates the worker, then that interval has to be masked, maybe inside some even bigger interval, but it can never be cut. So in our example, you see that inside the partition 0, 1, the worker is relatively better than the shirker. This ratio is bigger than that ratio, and therefore it's better. It has to be completely masked as it is, but if you look across the two partition cells, then 36% relative to 64 is higher than 0 relative to 80. So it's uniform domination of the worker across the cell. So this is the optimal partition. So you can, there may be many partitions, but you can always figure out, they form a lattice, okay? And you can find them by an algorithm. Now, the pure wage problem, we've just solved for the optimal titles. The pure wage problem was solved basically ignoring monotonicity by Holmstrom in 1982, and it's, you know, a slightly special case. Well, maybe not special. It's a continuous output case and differentiable, and you can, you know, take interior derivatives and stuff. And then by Park in 1995, and they made the assumption of domination or uniform domination. Okay, so this is more general because we don't assume any connection between F and G, except that the expectation with F is bigger than the expectation with G. And we impose monotonicity, and it turns out that thinking about the titles partition helps us get the right wage function, even when there isn't status involved at all. So the optimal wage has to be measurable with respect to the optimal titles partition. That's a theorem. And that means that if you can give titles and wages together, you might as well use the optimal titles partition, because wages by itself is already measurable with respect to the titles partition. So there's no need to hide anything from anybody. So public and private amount to the same thing. And in the special case where the workers are risk neutral, all the wages go to the top category as a bonus, and everyone else gets a flat wage. I should have said there's a minimum wage. You have to pay people more than 0. So to say in the picture, if this is the optimal titles partition, then the optimal wages, when wages are given alone, has to be measurable with respect to it. When they're given to, and when they're allowed together, of course, you can lower the wages a little bit because now people are getting a status incentive, but it's going to be the same function, same measurability. And in the case where the workers are risk neutral, you're going to only pay a wage bonus to the people at the very top. This is the 0 wage here. The wage bonus will only go to the people at the very top. And Parks got that same answer, though it had stochastic uniform domination of all the outputs. Here we don't assume uniform domination. We derive uniform domination on subintervals. Okay, so so you see already that we've got this big bonus to the people at the top. So if they, okay, so that's it. Now, furthermore, if you have cavity and so need many wages, then it turns out as you get more and more status, the size of the jumps gets bigger and bigger as you go up the scale. So the more the status is, the more the jumps at the top end have to go up. So increasing sigma increases the steepness of the increase of the wage function. They all start lower, but they increase faster. So in that sense, status creates more high wages. Let's do the other case, the disparate employees case. So in this case, let's start with two kinds of workers. If you work and you're an alpha worker, you do better than if you shirk. But even if you shirk, you're going to do better than a beta worker who works. And the output is uniformly distributed in these intervals. That's the luck. Okay, so how should we design the system in this case? So here we have high ability alphas, who have work or shirk, and low ability betas, work or shirk. Well, you could simply, since they're revealing themselves by the category, you could give a grade corresponding to each category. But then you see that the beta worker has no incentive to work. If he works, he gets here. If he shirks, he gets here. But he's going to be below, let's say there's one beta guy and one alpha guy. He's going to finish below the alpha guy no matter what. So he has no incentive to work. And the alpha guy has no status incentive to work either. So this is not a good titles partition because you give nobody any incentive. So the next one you might think of is broadening the B category. So here, now if the alpha guy shirks, he comes down here, which makes him equal to the beta worker. So the alpha employee has an incentive to work and get up here and get a higher grade, higher title, rather than shirking and getting here and being called equal to the beta worker. But unfortunately, the beta worker has no incentive to work because if he works, he gets up to here, but the alpha worker is already here, so he can't come equal. So even this is not going to get the beta worker to work. The beta worker is going to shirk, and the only Nash equilibrium is actually where they both shirk. So the only thing to do is to have this kind of category where you give a very broad swath of Bs. But not only doing beta quality work, but even a lot of the alpha quality work gets a B. Now you see that by working, assuming the alphas are working, beta gets 1 minus P chance of coming equal with the alpha worker. And by working, the alpha worker separates himself from the beta worker with probability P. So if you want to get them both to have the highest possible incentive, you'll set P equal to half. So lesson is that you want to have a very broad category of Bs to give the betas a chance to compete with the alphas. But of course, that means it's very hard to get an A. So let's now solve the general case. Suppose you have the same situation, but an arbitrary number of people of each type, an arbitrary number of types, but still this drawing disparate assumption. We could actually weaken that and allow the shirkers to drift down and get confused with the workers of the lower type, but it gets a little more complicated. Here, the simplest is just to stick with what we're talking about. So you're totally separated by your skill level. So what should the partitions be? Well, it could be that by analogy from what we just did, you do something like that, but that turns out not to be right. The incentives are fairly complicated because if this beta guy works, he comes here, so he gets even with some of the alphas who haven't quite been lucky. He also leaves behind some of the gammas, so there are people on both sides, and there's competing with people of his own type. So anyway, the formula is a little complicated for the incentives, but you can easily imagine it. The theorem is that this is what the optimal schedule is. It's a little bit of the optimal titles partition looks like this, where at the bottom you have the entire partition, and here it's somewhere in between for all the top categories. And it depends, the formula depends where the P's are, depends on the number of people of each type, etc., as Marina was asking. In a way I don't have time to explain, but we worked out. Now, if you just did wages alone, you'd have if you did wages alone, you would do the obvious thing. You just incentivize everybody by paying the difference in the wage, which would be high enough. So the lowest type shirkers would get the minimum wage. If the lowest type actually worked, they would get a boost where this gap was just enough to incentivize them to work. Okay, and that same wage would apply to the shirkers of the next highest category. Then the beta workers would have to get another boost in case they worked, and this gap would be just enough to incentivize them to work, and similarly for the alpha workers. But now you can combine the status with the wages, and so this thing is going to change. First of all, if there's a status incentive, these can come down. They could all come down, but that isn't the right, and it's going to be difficult to see how to combine them because this function is not measurable with respect to the optimal titles partition. There's going to be some funny combination. So what's the right way to do it? Not just to take the old titles partition and impose wages on that. That's not the right thing to do. Okay, so we argue why, you know, so the right thing to do, let's separate now the secret wages case from the public wages case. So in the secret wages case, optimal thing to do is to only have two titles. A B category, which means that you're not in the club. You're you know, you're one of the untouchables. You're not in the club. You're below. It means you're a shirker of the lowest quality, and everybody else is a member of the club because they've managed to go. They've actually achieved something. So it's out of the club or in the club. So you notice that the very lowest type has a huge incentive to work because by working, the lowest category comes equal with the whole population as opposed to shirking. So it's a huge status incentive to work. Then those workers at the bottom don't need much wage incentive to work. And then above that, you have to have the same gaps as before to get everybody else to work. So here you see that with private wages, the optimal thing is to concentrate all the status incentive at the bottom, and that lowers the entire wage scale, preserving the gaps, but bringing down the whole ladder and lowering wages. Now, if you have public wages, let's say there's a maximum public wage, you get a different solution. So here, you do give different titles, you know, to all the different categories. But you don't have these lines come in between the categories except at the top. And here, remember, here are the beta workers trying to somehow look like alphas. As before, you make a huge class of Bs, but now a gigantic class of Bs. It comes almost all the As, except for the very luckiest As. They worked hard, the various lucky alphas. They worked hard, and they were lucky to be at top of the scale. They get the highest wage, which is the maximum wage, M, whatever it was. That's their wage, and everybody else is on this ladder. 2 minutes here, I'm practically done. So what is the reason for that? The reason for that is you'd like to, this is the cheapest group at the top for raising the wages. If you raise their wages, you don't have to raise anyone beyond them. If you make this gap higher, that forces this wage to go higher and also this wage to go higher because these people care about the difference in the wage. So if you raise a wage at the beginning, you raise the whole ladder. So the cheapest place to raise the wage, the most efficient place to raise the wages is at the top. So you should give a big bonus to the people at the top. Now, the people in the middle, you can give them a big status incentive. Okay, so the betas come equal with almost all the alphas, and that's why there's such a huge category for the B category. So here we see that the wages go to the very top, and before in the other case we saw how the status went to the very bottom. So anyway, so that's the theorem, and we did the secret one. Sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. Okay, so the conclusion is that status is extremely important. When you add status, no ruler or no owner of a firm should imagine that they're doing their jobs well if they're not taking into account status. And some of our leaders pay very little attention to status and emphasizing the old virtues, which are really status things. It's embarrassing to be found to be not honest. So those must be emphasized. An owner can make more money, lower her wages by paying attention to status, but trying to incorporate status into wages has the effect that actually you should concentrate more at the, you should give few categories of status, you should concentrate the status at the bottom, and you're going to end up having to, take advantage of that by paying gigantic wages to the lucky CEO or the lucky people at the top. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So we do have time for a couple of questions, if there are any. There's one sort of broader question that was in the Q&A, and if there aren't any narrower questions, perhaps I will read that to you and you could take that.
Sure. Am I supposed to be reading questions? I'm not seeing anything.
No. So yeah, I was just waiting to see if anyone is raising their hand, which it appears is not the case. Okay, so there was a question from Ludwig Sinander in the Q&A saying, basically, what is the rationale for the meritocratic requirement? Presumably it's not optimal, and he's not sure it's normatively appealing either.
Well, Ludwig, you're a modern man. I think our society seems to be moving in that direction, but there was a time, and I still think it has a hold on a lot of people, that for a prize, for performance. Remember, these are titles given on the basis of performance. For it to resonate with people, for them to really care about it, it ought to be by virtue of earning it, by actually doing better. So you could say that some people are disadvantaged, as we're tending to say more often now to begin with, and that therefore there should be handicaps, or we should take that into account in awarding prizes. This is the most naked, give prizes for better performance. But I gave the quotation from Babe Ruth as an illustration of how there was, in the 1930s, during a terrible depression, by the way, it was still thought that, Babe Ruth justified his getting more money than the president because he was doing more than the president. He merited it by better performance. I think that there's a lot of people who think that for prizes for performance to be taken seriously and to actually give utility, they have to be for better performance. But I quite agree that you could give better incentives if you didn't have that. The requirement of meritocracy limits the title function, title schedule, and wage schedule, and by limiting the schedules, you get less profits. So Ludwig, you're right. You've tied your hands. You've gotten less profits, and I also agree that in these times, particularly today, meritocracy has come under attack and is no longer so natural as it used to be. But I still think it's an interesting case. We did anyway, and so we described that case. Pradeep, I should have let you answer the question. All right.
I just add one word. So you could give handicaps and still let the rest be meritocratic. So instead of giving them prizes just because of their disability, and that would probably promote more competition and work. So instead of rewarding a prize to those who are disabled, you give them a handicap and give them a boost on their performance, and then let them compete through the performance with the others. Maybe a better way, I don't know. Retain some competition, plus give them the handicap. Okay. Sorry, you have something to say? John?
No, I said all I have on that question.
Okay, thanks very much, John and Pradeep.
Okay.